Hello, and welcome back to part 5 of today's lecture series on reception and ancient art. And in this section, I'm going to be discussing a little bit about the darker side of the reception of the classical period and focusing on the fascist movement of the early 20th century in Italy and the way in which it adopted classical motifs, architectural, iconography, um, and cultural attributes in order to create an authoritarian state using that visual culture. So I want to begin with something that should be very familiar to us now and that I've mentioned in a previous lecture. And this is the story of the 5/6 scale replica paintings from the Room of the Mysteries that are located in the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I highly recommend post-quarantine that you check these out if you can. The museum is free, and these are they were created by a woman named Maria Barroso, who was a watercolor artist working in Italy in the early 20th century. And she encountered down in Pompeii Francis Kelsey, who was a professor at the University of Michigan at that time, and he commissioned her to create a color nearly full-size replica of the Room of the Mysteries paintings from the Villa of the Mysteries to sort of compensate for the fact that color photography was not really available at this time, right? It was a sort of a rarity and a highly expensive medium. So although these paintings were famous, they were well known, they had been published in black and white form, there was no way for someone who was unable to actually visit the site and get special permission to enter the Villa of the Mysteries to see them in color, to see them in their bright colored form. And so Francis Kelsey was interested in creating a museum at the University of Michigan in bringing back more tangible representations of the ancient world for his students, and this was one of the things that he commissioned. So Maria Barroso set to work. It took her 2 years almost to 18 months-ish to work on these paintings, and she replicated not only the paintings, the iconography, but also the damage at the time, the color at the time, and so they form a really beautiful document of what these paintings looked like prior to continued degradation over the 20th century. So you can see here, for example, here's a photograph of what the bride looks like in the Villa of the Mysteries today versus Maria Barroso's painting of the bride. So there are very small, subtle differences between her replica and the originals. But you can also see there's this little tiny patch that has been cleaned next to the bride's shoulder here that is much closer in color to what we see in the Barroso paintings. So actually, in some ways, visiting these replica paintings is almost a better approximation of what they looked like when initially excavated and seeing the originals. Now back to the point of fascism. So at the time that these paintings were created, Maria Barroso was involved in the fascist party, and in that movement she was something of a sympathizer and popular with them. And so her paintings were actually put on display by Mussolini in 1926 at the Villa Borghese, the National Gallery in Rome. And it was called at the time a great fascist triumph in the field of art, partly because of the fact that the subject matter drew on these Roman themes that were very appealing to the fascist movement, but also because of the sort of technical expertise of Maria Barroso in her ability to replicate them very exactly. So we have an interest in sort of scientific precision in artwork, scientific precision in the practice of archaeology, which was also a point of pride here, and the idea that these are magnificent artworks by a very talented member who is sympathetic to this movement. After their display, they were rolled up, sent to the University of Michigan, and sat in storage for many years until the construction of the new wing in the early 2000s, which enabled them to be put on display. But so the reason I tell you this story is to emphasize that, you know, the sort of fascist involvement of that entwines archaeology, fascist artwork and visual culture, politics, is very complicated. It involves not only people in Italy, but also people working in other countries at the time who had an interest in Italian archaeology, art history. And it involves people who are outside the political spectrum that you might traditionally think of. For example, these artists whose work becomes politically entwined, no matter sort of what they wanted it to be. So we have this interesting artifact available to us locally, so I hope that you take a look at it. And I also want to spend some time in this lecture discussing another aspect of Mussolini's Rome and plans for the city of Rome during the period of time that he was in power from 1922 up through most of World War II. And I've shown you this picture before of the parade in honor of Hitler and Mussolini that took place in 1938 down the Via dei Fori Imperiali in Rome. So that road, that giant triumphal straight that is sort of built between the Colosseum and the Vittorio Emanuele monument with the imperial fora lining the side that we looked at several classes ago. So in addition to the sort of direct involvement and changes that were made to the archaeological center of the city, another of Mussolini's projects was to create an outside sort of new city center for Rome that is on the outskirts of the antique city. And so this was done with an eye towards hosting the World's Fair in 1942, the planned World's Fair of 1942, which ends up getting canceled because of World War II. And it is the first sort of out of the city center business district that of Europe, right? So we see this as a model that is later adopted by other European cities. And it is called the Esposizione Universale Roma, or the EUR district. And it was planned throughout the 1930s. Mussolini actually fell from power and was killed before it was completed. So we see various phases of construction going on. But the impetus behind the design was created during this fascist period, and it is very sort of emblematic of a lot of the ideals that show up artistically and architecturally in how to create a sort of the visual culture of an authoritarian state. So here you can see from above, looking down at it, we have something that is much more planned than the city center of Rome. We have these large, broad avenues. We have a lot of sort of symmetrical streets that are running parallel to one another, buildings that are centered on various sort of monuments to catch your eye. So much more organized, much more of a planned city, drawing on both the sort of organizational impetus behind something like a Roman camp, but also modernistic, the impulses of modernism, things that we see in, for example, later in the 60s in Epcot in Disneyland. So that aesthetic. So if you are in EUR, it looks something like this. It's a kind of a weird place to visit. The scale of the architecture very much dwarfs you. So as you're moving between these rather uniform buildings, they're mostly clad in white travertine and marble. So they tend to kind of glow in the sun with these dark recessed windows, these kind of voids in the architecture. All very even, a lot of columns, a lot of little arcaded buildings. Something like on this Palazzo dei Congressi, the Congress Arena, there is a low dome that kind of recalls the dome of the Pantheon. So we have simplified, slimmed down, streamlined versions of classical architectural motifs here. We have sort of bare columns, solid pilasters, low arches. But one thing that is certainly carries over from the Roman architectural arena that we've discussed before is this emphasis on long views, the elongated masterly gaze that takes in different environments, that stops on these kind of eye-catching things for you to look at and to consider. So that emphasis on sort of symmetry, harmony, elongation of space, dwarfing scales, that is all drawing upon our classical past. So here is another one of the buildings in this district, one of the sort of capstone buildings of the district, if you will. It is called the Palazzo degli Uffici, or the Office Piazza, Office Palace, sorry. And it was probably the first building completed in the district. In 1939 it was built. And originally it was designed to sort of house both the ticket office for the World's Fair and some other, areas for gathering. So it was one of the first places that you would see coming into this World's Fair exposition area, if that was what it ended up being. And if we look at the outside of this building, part of the reason that I want to show it to you my head's in the way here, but it has an inscription on the outside of the building. You can see it here. So we have our colonnaded, our portico, kind of looks like a Greek stoa style building here with fountains, so integrating water. And the inscription means the third Rome will expand above other hills along the banks of the sacred river to the all the way to the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. And so this reference to the third Rome is kind of recalling this idea of a third Roman Empire. It also can be associated with things like the Third Reich in Nazi Italy. So Third Rome is after the Roman Empire and after the Papal States of Rome. This would be the new coalesced massive imperial state. So the idea was that Mussolini, by building the Aor district kind of out towards Ostia, moving towards the shoreline of the Tyrrhenian Sea from the city center of Rome, he was going to actually expand the city center, create a new fascist, a sort of virgin ground, a fascist city center for Rome, and expand this empire out to the shores of the sea and presumably also beyond, right, to be an expansive empire. So even today, that is written into the stone of this building should you visit the Aor district. And I also just want to show you the interior of that room there that you see just behind this colonnade. From the inside, this is what the room looks like. So we have these beautiful marble floors, very impressive scale. These windows are about 30 feet high on the right side of the room, but very simple, very spared down, very modernist, sleek in design. So it adopts a lot of the sort of imposing scale of the classical antique mode, but simplifies out a lot of the decorative elements that the kind of incrustation of decorative elements that defines a lot of Roman art. The messiness of it actually gets pared away. And finally, I want to show you this building called the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, which is probably the most famous of the buildings of Aor. It was completed in 1943, so much later, after World War II. And it is set atop a sort of monumental staircase on the opposite side from where this photo is taken. So it sits very high above the district. It's looks like a squared off Colosseum, right? Like it's a square version of the Colosseum, more or less. On the base, in the sort of base arcade of the lower story, there are 28 statues that represent various personified values of Italian society, like handicrafts, agriculture, philosophy, the rule of law, military genius, the genius of poetry, the genius of theater, all of these different kinds of personified values. And these statues are done, of course, in a highly classicizing style. So here we have our agriculture and our philosophy, who looks very much like Augustus. And they are above life size. As you can see, this little man is being dwarfed by these large statues here. So it's a very impressive structure. It really rises above the skyline of the area, and it draws the eye to this great celebration of Italian culture and the Italian people, especially in the sort of fascist sense of having your individual talents subsumed beneath the power of the state, right? The individual is in service to the state, a radical kind of nationalistic impulse. The building also has an inscription that I'm going to read you a translation of. A nation of poets, of artists, of heroes, of saints, of thinkers, of scientists, of navigators, of transmigrators. That last one refers to the fact that the Italians were some of the originators of transatlantic flights or transcontinental flights. So again, emphasizing that idea of labor in service to the state, the fact that the Italian nation as a whole is a superior one, as seen by its art and architecture. One last monument that I don't really have time to talk about, but I want to draw your attention to, is the Marconi Monument. It is meant to evoke a radio antenna in honor of Guglielmo Marconi, who was the creator of the radio antenna and made massive gains in long-term radio transmission. And iconography is an interesting hodgepodge of religious, drinking scenes, riding on a camel, all sorts of things. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Check it out. And now for your to-do. I would like you to reflect and write a paragraph about your thoughts on the susceptibility of the classics to co-option by authoritarian cultural movements. Right. So the classical period tends to appeal to people like white nationalists, authoritarians, fascists. Um, the Nazis really liked the Roman Empire. So why is that? I'm curious what you think. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. And I'm curious if you think that there's anything about those cultures themselves that kind of invites that sort of co-option.